again. We don't have a video on the Goldwater because I don't know. I just didn't feel like we needed one. Perhaps I'll change my mind. But this is for should be our number 8 paper, so I can change that on my notes. Or paper 7. I don't know. Well, technically this is our 7th paper, but we had 8. But we're on John Rawls now, and our paper is what are Rawls' 3 conditions for civil disobedience? Explain why you agree or disagree, and with any of the conditions you discuss using the relevant text as evidence. So I'll just go through my notes per usual. This will kind of help. I think again we're going to talk about the next few weeks, kind of this more moral dimension that's kind of inspired me since our anarchist readings, finishing up the semester. But here we have John Rawls. He passed away in 2000, I believe, but he's arguably considered still the most important American philosopher of the last 120, 150 years, at least with regards to political philosophy. And then here we have this kind of quotation. I probably need to make this bigger, but it says, a just society is a society that if you knew anything about it, you'd be willing to enter into a random place. And we'll get into that. But basically the reason why Rawls, I shouldn't say that. What's interesting about his influence is that it's noted that he kind of brought back this kind of social contract tradition or theory. And so again, we've our recurring themes in this course and bringing things back. And so we introduced social contract theory. Then we kind of questioned it with our brief kind of class assignment that we had, which I need to turn into a paper. And now we're back to kind of thinking about social contract. But again, what's interesting about this reading is that the kind of mandated readings from the school are not particularly on social contract. They're basically about what happens when social contract's broken or breaking down. So again, this kind of idea of recurring themes and things like that. So obviously I'll kind of interject my 2 cents, and we're going to get through this quickly, and then we'll talk about these things in class. But again, this is the paper. So we're kind of talking about civil disobedience again versus just your basic legal protesting. So right, we're kind of breaking the law when you're being disobedient. And what you'll notice about the readings too is it is kind of difficult to read Rawls. So I highly recommend, which I'll tell you that today, start reading now. And then these things will make more sense. I would definitely say you want to read this at least twice. But here we go. We have my little preview. So when covering this material during the fall of 2019, the class and I decided that there could be multiple interpretations to Rawls' 3 conditions for civil disobedience. So I got this again because I think reading it and teaching it, and students are coming up with different interpretations. And Rawls is not regarded as being one of the most concise or clear writers. You could kind of, even though I think his points are all related in some capacity, you could probably come up with more than 3 different ones. And so that's fine. You can do that in the paper. You just have to essentially, note them and tell me where you're getting them from. However, the most direct iteration of these civil disobedience rules, meaning justifications for, come from section 57 of your assigned readings. Okay, so if you go to that section, that's kind of, I'm helping you. There they are. But again, if you kind of are interested in the readings, you can kind of come up with other ones. You'll want to focus on terms like sense of justice for the majority, shared conception of justice, which may be something some of you disagree with. As a contract theorist, like our readings from earlier in the semester, Rawls believes there is some basic or foundational political principles that all people in a just society have agreed to. Otherwise, there could not be a legitimate society from the start. Same stuff from before. Right? But in reality, things change over time and people are not perfect. So what seems necessary is to establish a political framework that maintains political stability while also allowing mechanisms for things to change when there is a problem. So again, this is something that we noted with de Tocqueville about America, and one of the criticisms that Rawls gets is that he wasn't just a philosopher from America, he was an American philosopher. And so what I mean by that is that all these kind of values that unfortunately I think now are getting questioned, but I would say, if we kind of sit down and relax, they're not really questionable. I mean, like these kind of like well-meaning American values, Rawls was a champion of. He took the kind of positives about America. He definitely recognized the negatives, and he tried to work that out in a much more kind of normative or moral kind of framework. And this is one of these areas where he gets I won't say attacked, but he gets a lot of kind of modern day criticism from, is this aspect right here that I can't highlight so much. Sorry. So it's not letting me highlight it, but this kind of part right here. This idea of change, which again, this gets into the readings of like, what do we mean by, say, civil disobedience here, right, for our paper. Oh, there it goes. So yeah, this is kind of like the positive, and for those of you who are kind of finding the American system problematic, this will be one of the negatives that you'll definitely see about Rawls. This is why in the readings, Rawls continues to note he wants to maintain just and useful institutions while ensuring the outputs they are responsible for are also just. Sorry. I'm doing this before class, so I'm a little tired. Remember, Rawls is giving an account of what he calls a well-ordered society. It is more or less an optimal interpretation of a realistic just society with which to compare our world to. In this way, we can compare ourselves to the theory and see how well or poorly we are doing. Rawls' account provides us with a roadmap to establish a more just and equitable political, social, economic set of affairs. Okay, so I'll give you some background and we just have some good quotes here that I can move through. So Rawls is really influential. I can't get through all of it. I'm dissertating on this guy, and so even I get confused on things because now I'm questioning them as opposed to just trying to memorize them. But I'll give you the nitty-gritty. So Rawls is essentially known as an egalitarian liberal. So he falls in the liberal tradition which we talked about, which is that the individual is primary in that political formulation, right? So again, I think it's pretty much at the heart of the American political framework set up by the founders when I say that, right? I don't mean it in like some abstract sense. And so because of that, he needs to come up with a way, right, to rectify the problems that the liberal accounts have. And so many of you who were partial, say, to the Republican account, know from our Rousseau reading, sometimes you have to force people to be free. Well, that seems problematic, right? But there are definitely times, again, from learning from the coronavirus, right, that it seems like the society has to kind of pitch in together, maybe has to kind of minimize their individual freedom or curtail what they do individually for the collective. And again, from reading John Stuart Mill, we know there are kind of like moral arguments, with the harm principle in particular, that maybe mitigate the more problematic features of a liberal account that's focused on the individual and individual freedom. So Rawls gets around this in a different capacity. I won't get into the Kant, but was influential thinker, German thinker, that even Marx would have known about, was Immanuel Kant. I think the late 1700s, 1800s was when Kant was writing. And what Kant says is that, which I think Rawls is particularly noticing, which we'll get into our civil disobedience component, is that you don't want to take advantage of people. You don't take advantage of, you don't treat people like a mere means or like a tool. Right, so my phone I treat it like a mere means. I don't ask my phone what to do. I just need to text, and then I do it, and then I send my text. And so the example I always use when I was taught is, in distinguishing this, is, again, which feeds into the social contract or agreement, is the way in which we treat a bank teller. So, and most of us probably use the ATM, but sometimes you have to go into the bank and ask the bank teller to get you money or whatever. And if you go into the bank and go to the bank teller and you say, well, maybe you were going to draw a little more money out than you would have at the ATM. And so I want to pull out $500. Okay, sure. Put your card in the thing, put your number, ... So you guys do that. The teller gives you your money and you go home. They're happy, you're happy. Now, if you're a bank robber and maybe you just want to get in and out and you want $500 and you go into the bank and you steal the money by pointing a gun at the bank teller and you say, you say the same thing, give me $500. Okay, the bank teller does it. They gave you $500. They walk out. The same action happened, right? So people went in, they asked for money. Obviously, how you did it was different. And so in the first case, you respected the person as a human being, as a person is not a tool, right? And you entered into essentially an agreement. And in that agreement, you said, I have money in this bank, you're a worker, and against the currency you paid was politeness, and you showed respect to that person. And because you kind of fulfilled the contract of how these things work, like, yes, your money's here, but you're polite. They give you your money back, and then you left happy. Whereas the bank robber isn't following this kind of implicit kind of contract, right? They're just using the person like literally like an ATM machine, which is a tool, and they're taking the money. And that's kind of where Rawls is kind of coming from. So this is what we're going to get into, like, say, civil disobedience, is that there's still going to be maybe agreement, or might say unspoken tacit agreement, to how we go about doing these things when we're kind of rejecting the contract, right? So we're still even relying on, say, a normative kind of social contract, as opposed to the explicit one through law about what's valid or what are things that you can do. And we'll talk about this right now. So that idea of a mere means. Also, I think Rawls is going to think that we have this kind of social contract that he talks about here, what he says is kind of based on the veil of ignorance. And that's a key term. If you guys go on and do Rawls, you'll learn this much, much more. But the veil of ignorance is the idea that you just kind of don't know. It's a hypothetical like our other hypotheticals from Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau. You don't know anything about yourself. You don't know if you're disabled. You don't know what gender you are or how you gender identify. You don't know if you're homosexual. You don't know if you're even lazy. You don't know if you are a go-getter, a type A personality. You just don't know anything about yourself other than you're a person who will exist in the society. And then this idea is that this hypothetical situation would arise in which you would have to agree to the aspects of the society, right? So the classic one I think most people kind of understand with Rawls, which makes him this egalitarian liberal, right? So kind of like wants the best for every individual, right? It wants to minimize inequality, which is kind of this criticism that many of you have had about liberal capitalism and the American system. So Rawls is a liberal who's trying to mitigate that. So you get these kind of what the society is going to look like. You know, do you want there to be slavery? Well, the idea is if I don't know where I am in that society, I would say no. I wouldn't agree to it because I could be a slave, right? You wouldn't take the gamble that, well, this is one of the criticisms of Rawls, but generally it seems like people wouldn't take the gamble and go, well, only 10% of the population is a slave, so I'll take the gamble. Because, again, you could be that 10%. Do you want there to, so again, we can just kind of go down the list, and so obviously slavery is like one of the worst things, so we go to things that's, debatable still. Do you want there to be a social safety net, right? So like welfare, social security, things like of that nature, universal health care perhaps. It seems like you would say something like yes, or some formulation of yes, because you don't know where you'd end up. So you could be a person who's poor and has cancer, curable cancer. So I fall in that category. I had a very curable cancer, and I'm poor, and I lived. But do you want to be in a situation where, like, something that's relatively affordable because you are so destitute kills you? Probably not. So you don't want to live in a society like that. And so what you end up having is this kind of interesting thought experiment where you get individuals to contemplate their individual place in a society, right? So there's your liberal component. They're selfish, they're self-interested, but yet they're going to agree to something that's for the betterment of society, right? And so again, in not using people as a mere means, this kind of echoes the Kantian thing, which is that, okay, individuals live in a society and they're going to benefit from the existence of a society, right? But most of us recognize that you can't, if you don't go to the store and just get food and not pay for it, right? You don't receive a benefit without a cost. And so again, you might say that there's this kind of undercurrent Rawls that there's a society, and then if you're benefiting from its existence, from, the cops being out there stopping robbers and so on and so forth, it's more than just say what you benefit from, say, paying taxes, then you have to give back to the society. And so this is how he's going to have this kind of what he says in other stuff. The difference principle, yes, somewhat redistribution of wealth. It's not communist. It's not a totalizing redistribution of wealth, but it might be like, say, higher taxes on richer people to justify these more egalitarian policies. So again, you have someone on liberal grounds who has this in very monumental work. Again, it took him 20 years to write the book, from an article to the book, and then 15, 20 more years to do his response where he fixes these problems to a theory of justice, that book I'm talking about. So yeah, highly influential. I like it a lot. And as a side note, that I don't know how I didn't know this before, John Rawls, which again might explain some of his American leanings, served in World War II in the Philippines, and he was a literal war hero. I learned this year, or whenever I'm recording this is when I learned it. Can't believe I just learned it now. I believe he won a Bronze Star. He volunteered for a mission to rescue fellow soldiers in the Philippines. So yeah, the dude was the real deal. He lived it. He wasn't just some guy living on his ivory tower, philosopher. He was in the blood, shedding in the mud, shedding blood for America. So that might explain some of his stuff. And he also saw the devastation of war firsthand when they occupied Japan in the Pacific Theater, the American soldiers, and that influenced a lot of his thinking too. Is kind of the aftermath of fire bombings and the nuclear bomb being dropped So that's just food for thought. Again, I've had students who just discount Rawls because he's an old white man or was an old white man. Well, those people who are white and men are probably going to get old at some point, so I don't think that's a reason to discredit them. So here we just have some quotations, right? So we'll just go through this really quickly. Civil disobedience is a public, nonviolent, conscientious yet political act, contrary to law usually done with the aim of bringing. So there's going to be errors in this. Bringing about change in law or policies of government, right? So again, we've seen a lot of civil disobedience, but again, the difference is, with, like, say, with a lot of the social justice stuff going on, is that, to be fair, a lot of the social justice stuff has been probably mostly nonviolent, but there's been significant violence in places like, Minneapolis, Portland in particular. So again, this kind of idea of this rejection of violence is something that Rawls is, going to say that if you're being civilly disobedient, as opposed to being, how would the word be, maybe a revolutionary, that would be the difference, is that you're going to be committed to nonviolence. By engaging in civil disobedience, one intends then to address the sense of justice of the majority and to serve fair notice that in one's sincere and considered opinion, the conditions of free cooperation are being violated, right? So again, you have that idea of him championing someone like Dr. Martin Luther King, right? That you're a shared conception. One of the things Dr. King did was he talked about Christianity in general and the things that white Americans who were racist or white Americans who were apathetic, they might have shared this. If he found the commonality to pull on the moral strings of people for change, which again, we saw that in the Frederick Douglass reading as well, right? Where he's kind of saying, like, here's the American goals, and this is the failure of the Americans to live up to them, right? So this kind of common Americanism, or even again, common humanity. Thus, to respect another as a moral person is to try to understand his aims and interests from his standpoint and to present him with considerations that enable him to accept the constraints of his conduct. This reminds me of the notes from the Goldwater paper, and where you have the civil rights leader who basically says, from probably around the 90s, looking back on Goldwater's kind of conscientious conservatism, he didn't consider Barry Goldwater a racist, which would not work today. I think there are a lot of academics who do consider Goldwater a racist. And again, if we had the Twitter and things back then, you wouldn't have this kind of like considered view of your opponent. You'd just immediately make them the enemy. And to me, that's what Rawls is saying here. You have to kind of understand where other people are coming from. You can't just kind of have this kind of demagoguery or just kind of dismiss people because of, even if you find their views objectionable. You have to go, why, if we're being charitable, why are they saying the things that they're saying? Why are they advocating for the conditions with which they're arguing for? So this is kind of this moral duty that you have. So again, it's more than just like advice. By accepting the benefits of a society, we have an obligation to follow the rules of that society, right? So this goes, Rawls, I kind of mentioned this, talks about that earlier. This goes back to our Lockean readings, our Rousseauian readings, and even our Hobbesian readings. If the society we are a part of is reasonably just, even the existence of unjust laws, Rawls holds we ought to work within the system. Right? Unjust laws are different than unjust institutions. Right? So Rawls making this huge distinction. This is a distinction that many people are making right now. Again, I would be biased towards saying America generally is not an unjust system or institution, but we do have unjust kind of policies and laws that we can reevaluate and fix. And again, what's interesting about the laws is that, right, laws that could be meant for justice at one point can become unjust later on in the future. So that's something to consider, why things get so frustrating for a lot of us, especially when we're younger, is things change. History changes, conditions change, right? I think we kind of want to live in a world where we don't need affirmative action, but maybe we still live in a world where we need affirmative action. I don't know. To me, that's a perfect example. Unjust laws are easier to change than institutions. And this is literally from the reading, so again, I'm just giving them to you, but I would be really interested if you guys can kind of come up with your own. I think, what time are we? I don't even know what time. We're probably getting long here. So again, these are the ones that I found in the readings. Now, if one views such civil disobedience as an act addressed to the sense of the justice of the community. So again, this is something I think a lot of people are lacking. If you're not a Rawlsian, again, if you don't have to be a Rawlsian, you don't have to care about the community. You could say the community has a sense of false consciousness, that you have to change their minds, that you're defeating the point if you're appealing to the kind of common shared culture that people have. But this is what Rawls is saying, and I agree with it. The kind of sense of common this justice of the community, right? Then it seems reasonable, other things equal, to limit it to instances of substantial and clear injustice, and preferably to those which obstruct the path of removing injustices, For this reason, there is a presumption in favor of restricting civil disobedience to serious infringements of the first principle of justice, the principle of equal liberty, which just basically means that any rights that you say a society has, anyone gets those rights equally in a society, right? And to blatant violations of the second part of the second principle, the fair equality of opportunity principle, which basically means that anyone should have opportunity. It's pretty self-explanatory. I'll probably find this in class and read it to you guys, the principles of justice. Right, so you can see here, like pulling down statues. I mean, again, that person was a racist, but that doesn't have any impact on us now. It's literally just kind of like an artifice, a facade. It's just low on the totem pole. It wouldn't kind of require this kind of breaking the law, which again borders on violence when you tear these things down. But again, these things are debatable. So what do you mean by violence? If I was philosophically pushing back against this, is an interesting question. We might probably talk about that in class. A further condition on civil disobedience is the following. We may suppose that the normal appeals to the political majority have already been made in good faith, and they have failed. Right? The legal means of redress have proved of no avail. Since civil disobedience is a last resort, we should be sure that it is necessary. So again, we have we could see our Washington Du Bois debate here. Not that I think Du Bois was advocating for violence, but it's like, how long is this process supposed to take? How confrontational should we be? The normal process. I think Du Bois falls under the normal process, but I think I just idea of like, okay, how long do I have to go through the normal process for many of us? Is it enough just to have economic change that'll bring about these other changes, or do I go, there's a problem here? So again, we've encountered these questions already. A third and the last condition, it is conceivable, however, that even if it is unlikely that there should be many groups with an equally sound case in the sense justifying for being civilly disobedient, but that if they were all to act in this way, serious disorder would follow, which might well undermine the efficacy of the just constitution. I assume here there is a limit on the extent to which, this is interesting, civil disobedience can be engaged without leading to a breakdown in the respect for law and constitution, thereby setting in motion consequences unfortunate for all. Right? The ideal solution from a theoretical point of view call for cooperative political alliance of the minorities to regulate the overall level of dissent. Right? So again, it's just kind of like who has a bigger complaint at the moment. Again, we've seen this, let's say, the women's marches, where then you have like different kind of competing people protesting. You might have like the women's march, and then you have the conservative women were like, well, that march doesn't represent us. Here's our conservative view. And then within the, say, the women's march proper, there were like, LGBT members or women of color who are like, there's different complaints because of, say, this idea of intersectionality, many who have been encountered. It's a little more complicated than probably a lot of you appreciate, but that is that. And so there's a lot of different things to consider with here in civil disobedience. I'm sure many of you are going to disagree, which is totally fine. But again, remember with these readings, the objective is just to do the paper. Why you agree or disagree is a part of the paper, which is fair. But again, the main important thing is you really want to nail down what Rawls is saying. And so if you have a different take on the readings or interpret these readings slightly differently, then say that. It's okay. You don't have to just use these. And if you use these, obviously I want to have more explanation. If you're someone who's finding them, then, I'll go, okay, you found them and explain them. But here, if you're using mine, you're going to want to use examples. You're going to want to say, use your own interpretation to justify these claims. And so, again, I think one of the ideas that kind of resonate with people when I first taught this was, how you protest. And we've seen this. You guys have actually saw it. I taught this section, and then like a couple weeks after, we saw a lot of the George Floyd protests. But yeah, like a common tactic, especially out here in California, in LA, people do was like, say they'll protest on the freeway. They're trying to be civil disobedient. They're breaking these kind of like traffic laws, like don't be on the freeway, which are kind of meant for your health. Don't get hit by a car. And they're kind of encumbering their neighbors to kind of get a point across. If I was in traffic, I'd be irritated. But maybe that works. Maybe I should consider what these people are saying, right? So again, like how you do that, where you protest, these are kind of tactics with regards to civil disobedience. But one place I think with Rawls, what we just read that I used last time was, maybe it's acceptable to protest on the streets, like literally the streets, not like figuratively. But maybe it's not okay to protest in an emergency room or protest in the operating room, right? Like that would get your point across. People would go, hey, but if I'm sick or I'm dying, it's not an appropriate place. that seemed to be an example that resonated with people that we were able to kind of get a lot of kind of thought out of. So that's what I'll leave you with. Like, think about like how we protest. You know, do we use all of the mechanisms available? You know, if I think again, if you were going to reject Rawls, which I imagine some of you are going to do, you know, what do I do in the case? Do I even appeal to civil disobedience if I think the system's totalizingly corrupt? You know, so again, we can think about our anarchist reading and our Marxist readings, who are kind of, you know, revolutionary. I think it's fair to say with regards to those readings. I don't think that's objectionable. So yeah, what do we do in those instances? So is Rawls right? Do you think the American case is like, you know, salvageable if you think it's problematic? Do you think you have a moral obligation to your neighbors in a kind of community sense, not a society sense, a community sense, people who kind of exist in the same place, to kind of appeal to shared values? Is this something the anarchists, if you want to pull in those readings, and Marxists do, which I think they might do? You know, I think Marx in particular, because we have a much more, I got to find a better Goldman reading, but I think Marx does that. He says, you know, we're kind of workers of the world unite. Like, most of us are workers. And so we kind of have this kind of common humanity that are wage slaves. And let's throw off our chains. Yeah, I think I could, if I spent enough time, I could probably make that work with this Rawlsian logic. So it's the last paper, last video. Hopefully it's helpful, and I will see you guys hopefully in cyberspace or on campus or whatever. So see you later.